This episode of That's Life Uncovered is sponsored by HelloFresh. You are now listening to That's Life Uncovered, a One Love media production. Now, without further ado, here's your host with the most, Kyle Fields.
Imagine it. It's early September 2001. The summer's breath still clings to the air, heavy and sweet. School buses are back on the roads. Department stores have swapped out their bathing suits for sweaters, and football season is waking up. The hum of normal life is everywhere. So normal, it's almost forgettable. Across America, people are heading to work, grabbing their morning coffees, making mental notes about meetings, grocery lists, dentist appointments. There's a casual invincibility in the way people move through their day. The belief that tomorrow will look just like today. New York City's skyline is whole. The Twin Towers, icons of American ambition, pierce the sky like steel needles. Thousands move through them every day. Secretaries, brokers, window washers, janitors. If you stood at their base and craned your neck back, the towers stretched so high they seemed to touch the heavens. At airports, security is casual. You can walk a loved one right to the gate, kiss them goodbye at the door of the plane. Shoes stay on, bottled water is allowed. Nobody questions anything. On the evening news, stories about terrorism feel like far-off headlines. Embassies bombed in Africa? That's tragic, but it's over there. USS Cole attacked by suicide bombers? Sad, sure, but not here. A CIA memo warning bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S.? Filed away, forgotten, a whisper in a room full of noise. The mood in America is light, optimistic. The 90s tech boom left the country flush with money and confidence. President George W. Bush has been in office for less than a year. Gas is about $1.50 a gallon. The biggest pop songs are about love and heartbreak, not fear and loss. September 10th, 2001. The final day of the world as we knew it. Office workers leave their desks, planning tomorrow's meetings. Children pack up their backpacks without knowing their innocence will be stolen. Planes prepare for their morning flights. Mechanical birds lined up in quiet anticipation. The skyline sleeps in the starlight, unknowing. And somewhere across the ocean, in dusty rooms lit by single bare bulbs, men kneel and pray one last time before sealing the fate of thousands. Tomorrow, the world will shatter, but tonight it is whole. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. The sun rises over the East Coast in a blaze of golden light. The sky is a perfect, endless blue, a painter's sky. No clouds, no warnings, just an ordinary morning, just another Tuesday. At Logan Airport in Boston, travelers sip their coffee, scan newspapers, chat sleepily at their gates. Flight 11, a Boeing 767 bound for Los Angeles, begins boarding. Among those passengers are business travelers, vacationers, and a group of school children. Also, quietly boarding, blending into the background, are 5 hijackers. A few gates away, Flight 175, another 767, boards its passengers for LA2. Another group of hijackers boards there as well. No one notices anything. No one thinks anything is wrong. Why would they? In Washington, D.C., another airport is humming awake. At Dulles International, passengers for Flight 77 board a 757 headed for Los Angeles. At Newark Airport, passengers for United Flight 93 settle in for what should be a routine cross-country trip to San Francisco. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 lifts off from Boston. A few minutes later, United Flight 175 follows. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 is airborne. At 8:42 a.m., United Flight 93 takes off, delayed by runway traffic. That delay would later become fate-altering as we know it. 8:14 a.m., Flight 11 stops responding to air traffic control. Moments later, air traffic controllers hear a chilling transmission.
We have some plane. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay.
The realization spreads in slow horror across radar screens and headsets. This isn't a typical hijacking. This isn't a demand to be flown to Cuba. This feels different. Worse. 8:46 a.m. Flight 11, flying low and impossibly fast, barrels toward Lower Manhattan. At 8:46 and 40 seconds, it slams into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between the 93rd and 99th floors. The explosion blooms against the blue sky like a hellish flower. Fire and steel twist together. Papers, glass, and debris rain down over the city like a grotesque ticker tape parade. Screams fill the streets. At first, the nation thinks it's an accident, a tragic mistake, maybe a small commuter plane lost in the sun. News anchors scramble to explain the unexplainable. They rush to send choppers to get footage of the wreck. But then, 9:03 a.m., United Flight 175, also hijacked, slams into the South Tower. The fireball is bigger, fiercer. Millions watch it live on television, the horrifying realization dawning all at once. This is not an accident. America is under attack. If your brain's been on survival mode lately, trust me, making food doesn't have to feel like another battle. HelloFresh saved me from some of the lowest effort dinners I've ever made. You can get everything pre-portioned. The instructions are human proof and you feel like a grown adult again. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code POGHF158135 for 10 free meals plus free add-ons for life, but for a limited time and first-time subscribers only. You deserve more than freezer pizza, even on your worst days. 9:37 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 turned around midair by hijackers, slams into the Pentagon, the heart of America's military. Back over Pennsylvania, Flight 93's passengers have received calls from loved ones. They know what's happening. They know their plane is a part of the plan, and they chose to fight back. The last sounds from the cockpit are screams and struggles. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashes in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, never reaching its intended target, believed either to be the Capitol or the White House. Meanwhile, in New York at 9:59 a.m., the unthinkable happens. The South Tower collapses in a monstrous roar, pancaking floor by floor in a horrifying freefall. Dust floods the city streets like a tidal wave. First responders run towards the wreckage, many knowing they may not survive. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower falls too. The mighty Twin Towers, once symbols of strength and commerce, are now reduced to ashes and ruin in less than 2 hours. The skyline is broken. The world has changed, and nothing will ever be the same again. It's hard to describe what it felt like in that moment. Even harder to explain how the world seemed to fracture in real time, because trauma doesn't always announce itself with a bang. Sometimes it walks through your front door when you're just a kid expecting a normal afternoon. The smoke had barely begun to clear when the world was left reeling. But for some, it was already too late. The echoes of the terror had been set into motion long before that fateful morning. And in the weeks that followed, questions began to rise. Questions that some would find hard to ignore, while others would desperately try to bury. What followed the attacks was a powerful tidal wave of fear, patriotism, and the need for retribution. For a nation that had never truly faced an attack on its own soil at this scale, the floodgates to a new reality were opened. As the death toll climbed and the images, the collapsed towers and the Pentagon's charred remains seared themselves into the mind of millions, the world began to reshape itself. Even in the earliest days after the attack, officials began to paint a picture. This wasn't just an isolated act of terror. This was an orchestrated assault on the very ideals of freedom, and it was just the beginning. But what many failed to acknowledge or outright ignored was the uncomfortable truth. The United States had been warned. The 9/11 Commission, the investigative body that was tasked with uncovering the roots of the attack, would later reveal startling details about intelligence lapses, missed opportunities, and an array of warnings that had gone unheeded. It wasn't as simple as saying we were blindsided. because much of the information about Al Qaeda and its operatives had been on the radar for years before 2001. The intelligence community, particularly the CIA, was already neck deep in operations against Al Qaeda. But in hindsight, it's clear that something went wrong. There was a mismatch of intelligence sharing between agencies, conflicting priorities, and not a single piece of evidence linking all the dots together. To make matters worse, the FBI and the CIA, each with their own agenda, were seemingly working in silos, a national security recipe for disaster. We now know that the CIA had managed to infiltrate Al Qaeda cells, and yet they failed to connect the dots in a meaningful way that could have saved thousands of lives. There were opportunities for disruptions, but politics and jurisdictional red tape tied the hands of the very people who were meant to protect us. And then there's the question, why were certain operatives, namely Osama bin Laden, not apprehended earlier despite a decade-long hunt for him? The puzzle pieces don't quite fit, and the frustration that fills the gaps continues to haunt the survivors and the families and those who were on the front lines that day. But there's more, much more, that needs to be uncovered, because this wasn't just an attack. This was an operation built on years of intelligence, a house of cards waiting to collapse. And we've barely just begun to scratch the surface of how deeply the U.S. government's complacency allowed it to happen. The aftermath of 9/11 wasn't just about the rubble, the mourning, or the pledges to never forget. It was about the long, silent ripples that spread through the very foundations of what Americans believed about their country, their leaders, and their safety. Within weeks of the attacks, fear was weaponized into legislation. In October 2001, the USA Patriot Act was passed, overwhelmingly, almost blindly. Under the guise of national security, the government was given sweeping new powers: surveillance without warrants, indefinite detention of immigrants, the ability to bypass constitutional rights in the name of fighting terrorism. The American public, traumatized and desperate for safety, barely flinched. But make no mistake, this was not a temporary measure. It fundamentally changed the relationship between citizens and the state. The government now had the ability to monitor, record, and detain at an unprecedented scale, and they used it. Sometimes for good, sometimes simply because they could. By March 2003, the U.S. had shifted from Afghanistan to Iraq, a country that had no operational ties to 9/11, but was painted with the same brush of fear, weapons of mass destruction, the buzzword of an era. The justifications were thin, the evidence weaker, yet still soldiers were sent, lives were lost, and an entire region was destabilized. Hundreds of thousands of civilians paid with their lives. Thousands of American soldiers came home broken, physically, mentally, and spiritually. The ripple of 9/11 didn't stop at the Hudson River. It tore across the oceans, continents, and hearts. And with every revelation that came in the years that followed, the false intelligence reports, the torture memos, the black sites, the public's faith in their government began to erode. The seed planted on that September morning wasn't just fear, it was doubt. Doubt about what was real, doubt about who could be trusted, doubt about whether the nation they loved could ever be the same again. And maybe it wasn't meant to be. We can't talk about 9/11 without talking about how it didn't just change the skyline of New York City. It changed the DNA of America itself. It's been over 2 decades, and yet September 11th still feels close enough to touch. A ghost that walks among us every time we see an airport security line, every time we hear a politician invoke national security, every time we remember that for some people the world ended on a Tuesday morning. For me personally, I was just 11 years old when I walked through the front door of my house and watched, frozen, as the second tower fell. I remember my mom standing there, covering her mouth, whispering, "Dear God." What I thought would be a fun day because they let us out of school early turned into the first time I ever felt real trauma. I watched them replay the footage, people jumping from towers, choosing death on their own terms rather than waiting for the building to claim them. That kind of memory doesn't fade. It etches itself into your brain. And I know I'm not alone. Every American who lived through that day, whether they were 5 or 50, carries that scar somewhere deep inside them. But maybe the deeper tragedy is that in the years that followed, instead of healing, that scar was picked at and exploited by politicians, by systems, by fear itself. We didn't just lose 2,977 lives that day. We lost trust. We lost innocence. We lost the luxury of believing that some things were untouchable. This won't be the last time that we talk about 9/11, because to understand who we are as a nation, the broken systems, the paranoia, the questions that never got answered, you have to go back to the days when everything changed. We owe it to the ones we lost. We owe it to the ones still fighting to be heard, and we owe it to ourselves.
That's Life Uncovered is written and hosted by Kyle Fields and scripted by Mary Rodriguez. Production and editing by One Love Media. All rights reserved. Did you know that right now you can get a 7-day free trial of the Members Lounge? Take advantage of our member-exclusive show where we hold nothing back. You can start your trial by going to patreon.com/OneLoveFLA.